This is the Retirement Planning University podcast with Jordan Schwartz and Phillis Pulvinas.
Welcome back to the Retirement Planning University podcast. I'm your host, Jordan Schwartz. I'm joined here by my pal, my friend, my co-host, Phillis. Phillis, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Jordan. Good to be with you today.
Good to be with you too. I know we've been chatting on the phone here more than usual lately, so I always love getting to talk to you, and I'm really excited about our guest for today. This is someone who I've had a very close relationship for years, someone who is an outstanding financial advisor, truly cares about the client, and always puts their interest ahead of their own. Our guest is Thomas Reilly, lead financial advisor in helping clients in a lot of different cities across the country. Thomas, you're in Denver. You're oftentimes in Chicago, Washington, D.C. So, Thomas, welcome.
Glad to be here, Jordan, and nice hearing from you too as well, Phyllis.
Hey, Thomas. Good to be with you.
Thomas, I got a question for you because Thomas has two young kids. How are you helping them prepare for retirement? Because I know not both of them speak yet because they're young, but what are you doing to prep your kiddos to get them ready for retirement?
You know, one thing I always tell, the classes that I teach and the people in front of me during taxes is that whenever I'm trying to teach my little ones about finances, them being 2-year-olds and a 6-month-old, most financial topics go right over their head. But I found out you can teach a 2-year-old about taxes. So anytime he gets a really good dessert, I'll just take a bite out of the dessert beforehand, and then he gets what's left over. And guess what, Jordan? He hates taxes.
Smart boy. That's cool. Phil, you and I talk about this all the time, and you personally, I think, subscribe to this because you love what you do. You know, I would argue you probably don't feel like it's work. Getting to help people with their retirement planning is a noble cause. But one of the biggest questions that I get is, how do you know when you're ready for retirement? Many people who are listening to this, their friends are retiring. They're thinking about retiring. They're seeing coworkers at work. So I really wanted to do a deep dive into that today. Phil, you know, you're unique in that if you wanted to retire, you could, but you love doing what you're doing.
Yeah, I almost feel guilty, but for not retiring. But yeah, as long as I can feel impactful and it makes a difference and I've got the energy for it, why retire? So I think there's a lot of elements to it. It's not just the financial side. The financial side, of course, is don't retire before you can afford to, and you better be sure that you know what you need to have to retire. But the other side is, you know, how are you going to feel emotionally with the rest of your life if you don't necessarily have that purpose? What's your other purpose going to be? So you've got to figure out, what does life look like next? I know for myself personally, love to travel, love to see friends, but to do it all day, every day, I'm just not there yet. And I think that would be a big deal if all of a sudden I pulled the plug and went there, but, you know, decided to do that. So that is, every day I counsel people on that side of things as well. And I think that's an important part of it.
How do you think that plays a role, Thomas, from a planning standpoint, which obviously you got to make sure the money piece is right. And we'll dive into that in a little bit, but really on the emotional side, how do you think that plays a role?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a big decision for people to retire when you go from working 30 plus years, 40 hours a week. And you always have something as far as what Phyllis was saying is, you know, a purpose. You know, maybe someone doesn't love their job, but it's what they do and keeps them busy. So I think it's really putting as much planning into the finances as much as putting a planning into place and finding out what you are going to be doing, spending your time on. Because I've had several clients, Jordan and Phyllis, that they were a CPA for 30 plus years or an attorney. And they told me, hey, Thomas, I never want to work another day in my life. And then I'll meet with them 6 months or a year later. And they're doing something else now. And they just said they couldn't stop working. They kind of lost that drive once they're completely done. So I think having a plan in place as far as what you're going to spend your time on is a big area that people maybe don't focus on that they should.
You know, it's funny. My mom, she taught home economics. I think now it's called family and consumer science. She taught that for, 35 years. And she retired a few years ago. And very shortly afterwards, just felt like she was missing that purpose, kind of like what you're talking about, Phyllis. And she started a little Etsy shop where she likes to sew. So like during the pandemic, she made fabric masks that had like different, logos of schools and different things people like, and makes Christmas ornaments and does some different things like that. So, I think for her, she just felt like she wasn't ready. And maybe that's one of the first things that when you are starting to think about, am I ready for retirement? Take the money piece out of the equation for a second. Do you feel ready to retire? Like, are you there yet? Because I definitely think that, it's kind of like when you find a life partner. When you know. I knew with my wife right after I met her. And I think my mom kind of mentioned this. I don't know, Phyllis, if you've had this experience, or Thomas, with your clients, you've had this, but I think most clients kind of know when it's time to retire.
I would agree. And one thing sometimes that's difficult to consider, sometimes someone will come in and say, yeah, it's a certain age and this is when I should retire because that's what I'm supposed to do. But kind of thinking it through, at this point, people might consider working longer because we could be retired for so long as life expectancy goes up. So it just, really defining why. It's not good enough to say, well, 62, time for the gold watch and get out, or 65, I'm on Medicare and I can get out, but really consider what that looks like. I really do think, because most of the people we meet, my generation, I don't know about you guys, but we've been good stewards of our money, and we've saved for retirement. So it's not necessarily a problem about having enough to retire, but what are we going to do is of equal importance. And I can't stress that enough to think through that.
Yeah, and I agree with you, Phyllis. When someone makes that decision to retire, there's so much that goes into it. And I think sometimes people forget that, there's a lot of different things that you can do in your life. And sometimes retirement can be the start of a new adventure. Doesn't necessarily mean that you have to stop working, but, spend more time with your favorite charity, go on that trip that you never had a chance to do. But setting some things and planning some things actually can make a big difference as well.
So maybe part of this is don't retire just because you're supposed to retire, right? At 62 or at 65 or 67, it's really, when do you feel ready? Because Phil, one thing I know about you too, and I'm the same way too, is you are not conventional, right? You go by the beat of your own drum. And I think the same thing should be said for retirement planning. What else do you think goes into the equation? So we got basically the psychology side of it, is when do you feel ready? When is it time?
Yeah, one of the biggest things I hear from just everyone is, hey, Thomas, retirement sounds great, but I've been making $10,000 a month for the past 30 plus years or whatever that amount is, and that paycheck isn't coming in. I think that's a fear and kind of an uncomfortable feeling that a lot of people don't necessarily talk about, but has to be addressed and looked at.
So is maybe part of this looking and seeing, okay, I feel ready to retire, but maybe for someone out there who knows, okay, I'm not ready to retire financially, but I want to. What are some things that someone in that position could do to maybe bridge the gap between retirement, but not having to necessarily access their monies right away, where if they're just burnt out from the corporate rat race and they want to be done with it?
Yeah. And, I'd love to hear Phyllis's thoughts on this as well, but I would say, don't be afraid to change things up even later in your career. My mom, she was a microbiologist for 30 plus years. And then, one day they took the microbiology department and moved it to another hospital across the state. And she was given the option to basically, you could stop working, or she could help run a blood bank at the hospital. And that's what she did. So I think there's always something else out there, and don't be afraid to adventure out to explore other things that maybe you are happy with what you're currently doing, but you can find something else that'll give you that purpose and maybe not make as much money, but still help bridge that gap between where you're at and where you want to be for retirement.
Do you guys find the same thing? Sometimes clients will come in to me and they are ready to retire and they do have hobbies and they do want to travel, but the fear of knowing whether they can retire because they don't have a distribution strategy. They're still accumulating. I see that all the time. You see the same thing, and what do you do to ease their mind in that process?
So for me, in looking at it, it's really doing a deep dive into the numbers, looking at your expenses. And, it takes work to actually go through and plan for retirement and make that decision there. Most people get scared about retirement, not necessarily because they don't think they can do it, but they haven't taken the time to make sure they feel comfortable making that decision. So there is work involved. You have to look at your finances. You have to look at your budget. But it's not, impossible to do for me and most things in life. For a lot of people, it's a matter of just deciding to do the work. And once you start it, it's usually not as much work as people think. And I think that's why we all do what we do. We're very passionate about it. We're the doctors of retirement planning, I would say. So there are people out there that can help you. You just have to make that decision if you want help or, do things on your own as well.
So Thomas, it kind of sounds like what you're saying is, the way Phyllis and you and I talk about this a lot, there's that accumulation phase versus the distribution phase, right? The accumulation phase is when someone's building a pile of money. The distribution phase is when someone's strategically pulling out money from that pile of money to support and sustain their lifestyle. And kind of what we're talking about is the apex of the mountain, so to speak, right? That point in time where we go from accumulation to distribution, where when we're starting to look at some of those different parts, obviously we've got to come up with a distribution strategy. Where I think a lot of people go to first is figuring out the money piece, right? How much money do I need for the rest of my life? Everyone's different, but what are some ways that you all go about really figuring out when you're meeting with someone if they have enough money or if what they've saved is enough to last them for the rest of their life?
I think a real key piece of that is really making sure that they understand what they're going to spend their money on and look at real numbers, not just what they think, but a great time to have a conversation with your spouse if you're married and really get into the numbers. And I tell people at this point, it should be a fun budget, not like when you're raising your kids and you're young and you're trying to save for, different things for their school and everything, but what's it going to cost? Because it's really daunting if you retire and don't have enough money or you don't know or you're afraid. But I also think that oftentimes, and I don't know if you see the same thing, guys, but I'm sure you probably do, that oftentimes people don't know what they don't know. They're so focused on just the growth of their money. They don't know how to begin the process of figuring out how they unravel that and how much they actually need realistically. And the first place for me is to help them really dig into that budget.
Yeah. And I really agree with you there, Phyllis, because, a lot of people, and I don't know if you all agree with this or not, they say they know how much they're spending. But oftentimes what I found when doing detailed income planning with clients is that most people do spend more than they think. And it's not uncommon that happens, to where I've had several people tell me, hey, Thomas, I only spend $5,000 a month, but, they've been netting into their bank account, say 10 grand a month. And every single month, there's nothing left over. So where's that extra money going to? I think it's what Phyllis was just talking about, is looking at actually what you're spending that money on. And for retirement, you can make it fun. You're not traveling as much, or maybe not buying clothes for work, but you probably will be spending that money on other things and other, experiences in your life too.
Every day is Saturday when you're retired.
Love that.
Twiddling your thumbs. You're going to spend more. You really are. So I'm a nag with that, really digging in. Well, when you travel, how do you travel? What type of money do you spend on hotels and food and all of that? And once they get rolling on it, they do see that they're probably going to spend more.
If you had to, what percentage of people do you think you're meeting with, say, Thomas, I'm spending $5,000 a month, but you find they're spending more? Is it half the people you meet with, or is it 70 or 80%, or is it basically everybody?
I would say, from a ballpark number, at least 60%.
Wow.
60%.
I would agree.
So maybe if we're doing some takeaways from this, number one is know your budget, and not what you think your budget is, but what are the actual numbers? And you can use most apps like Quicken or things like that. I personally, every single month, at the end of the month, I go through and I write down every single thing I spent and summarize it at the end of the month, because it holds me accountable to knowing not how much do I think I'm spending, but what am I really spending? That makes a ton of sense.
Yeah. And I think for a lot of people out there, I meet with some people that are just like you, Jordan, and they're very looking at their budget, keeping track of it. And then I think for a lot of people and a lot of listeners right now, they haven't done that. And I think that's normal. But it's 2023 and we have technology these days to where you can pull out that smartphone that you have, Android or iPhone, and download an app and link it to your credit cards or bank accounts, and it'll do everything for you. So using technology can definitely help you with the budgeting to where it can be a lot of work, but it can take away a lot of the work as well.
No, I don't know if you guys have ever done this, but sometimes just a quick way of looking at the budget is asking people how much they bring in each month after they pay their taxes, after they do their 401k, and then ask them at the end of the year, how much did their savings accounts go up besides the 401k? And if it hasn't, well, then we go back to every day is Saturday. Are you really going to spend less? And then we start digging into that. And generally, people are going to spend as much as they did while they're working, albeit they're going to switch off what they spend it on, or maybe leave it a little bit more. But that's a quick way to get the ball rolling there.
Yeah, I agree with you there.
Phyllis, something that you just said that I like to ask clients from time to time from a planning standpoint is, what do you want your retirement to look like? Because we're talking about budget now, but what's the actual budget look like in retirement? Because some people are like, you know what? I spent a lot of money during my working years. I'm comfortable with cutting my lifestyle. And then some people actually want to increase their quality of life in retirement. And to me, that's a big thing. So how does someone start to prepare for those types of things?
Yeah, I can speak to this here. I would say it's going back to that planning piece of it. If you want to go on those trips and think about how many trips you want to go on and look into how much it's going to cost. If you want to go to Australia or go to Europe, are you going to spend $10,000 on a week trip, or are you going to go for 3 weeks and spend a lot more than that? So I think it's actually looking at some of those big items. And for other people, it's getting an RV and traveling. Some people don't think about, hey, it can be quite a bit to fill up an RV these days as far as gas goes, and then you're traveling, buying food. So I think it's 2 items. One is looking at what are you going to be doing, traveling and visiting family, or going on trips, or maybe taking up a new hobby like golf as well. And then looking at the cost of that there.
Part of our role is to help them paint the picture of what they want their retirement to look like, and then help them kind of begin to put a price tag on it.
When you start meeting with someone and you're uncovering these different pieces of the puzzle, how do you start to figure out what that number is? Now, obviously, we've got to do complex retirement income planning, but for someone who's listening to this, who just wants to get a ballpark, how do you go about ballparking if somebody's got enough money for their retirement?
One thing that we teach during our retirement planning university classes is this isn't the best way, but I would say that if you're wanting to do the back of the napkin math and looking at have you saved enough, a safe withdrawal rate of a portfolio is going to be between that 3 to 5%. And so most people we meet, if they're spending, say, $5,000 a month, but their Social Security only brings in, $4,000 a month, they need to generate $1,000 from their investments and their savings. And is that amount that they need to generate on an annual basis 3 to 5% of their portfolio? And if it's not, more times, then they're not quite ready from a financial standpoint to retire. Now, there's more that goes into it, but that's one way to look at it.
I would always say, like you're saying, back of the envelope, double that number. So if you come up with, you need 400, now life is going to happen. Let's double it. And if you've got 800,000, if you get your investments in the right place, and this is truly your budget, you should be good to go.
You could do one of two things then. You could either take what you've saved for retirement and multiply it by, let's say someone did a 4.5% withdrawal rate. So you can multiply it by 4.5%. Or if you truly know what your budget is, you could divide your yearly budget by 4.5%. But what you're saying, Phyllis, is that to really have that sense of security and safety in that, because of life, because of inflation, because of taxes, we probably need to double that number.
That's exactly right.
So can you give me an example of that, Thomas? Like, how would we go about solving that for someone who's wanting to do some of the back of napkin math? Can you walk our listeners through how they would go about doing that?
Yeah. So it's looking at your investments, looking at your 401ks, the IRAs. You can look at if you have real estate, rental properties, doing the math and adding it up there. And then it's also looking at most people listening on this podcast right now, everyone's going to have Social Security, but most people don't have a pension. And realizing that, do we have enough based on how much we've saved and how much we're wanting to spend there? So adding up the assets and then looking at really how much you need on a monthly basis and doing that math, 5%. Well, if it's not going to cover the budget, then you can double it. And I would say most times 90% of people we're talking to and listening right now, they need that number doubled. You have things happen, pandemics, high inflation, taxes, and so on.
That's a good way to just begin the conversation and then drill down on it. But that's, that is a good process for someone listening who just wants to get started. Just take the back of the envelope. What do you spend? How much do you have saved? What are your fixed sources? What's your gap each month? Multiply that by 12 and divide it by, I like 4% personally.
So let's do some math. So if let's say somebody's got $1 million saved for retirement, and that's not including their house, that's not including the bank, that's just including money that can generate income for them for retirement. Take $1 million, and let's say we multiply that by 4.5%, that kind of safe withdrawal rate. That would mean then someone would need about they would be able to generate about $45,000 a year of income for the rest of their life from that money. But if someone's thinking, oh, I've got $1 million and I can do it, we still have to account for the cushion, inflation, taxes, all those things. So maybe on the flip side of that, if someone, let's say, needs, for your example, Thomas, they needed, let's say, $5,000, but we really find it's $7,000 a month they need. Take that over 12 months in a year, which would put us at $84,000. Now, that would not include Social Security. Let's say someone just needed $7,000 a month from their investments. If we divide that by 4.5%, that would mean someone would need probably about $1.8 million saved for retirement. Again, this is not including taxes, inflation, those types of things.
And you have to, put those in the calculation. And I think that's, what we do, and we spend a lot of time on it. But most people, we're working with, the bulk of their money is in tax deferred accounts, IRAs, 401ks. And people forget, well, the shortfall you're looking at right now oftentimes is the net number. You're not counting for a 25% tax bill to Uncle Sam. And that's why we want people to double it. Or you're not counting on the world stopping and shutting down from a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic or other events that arise too.
Yeah, absolutely. That the unknowns you've got to account for. And most people really have never considered taxes. Those people don't want to consider a catastrophic illness and all the ramifications of that. We can do a more elaborate plan and figure out what the taxes are. But again, back of the envelope, if you double it, if you double that number, you're going to get close.
Yeah. And I think another important piece that you just brought up, Phyllis, is health and healthcare. Because if you look at my clients that I work with a lot in Chicago, DC, Denver, cost of living isn't cheap, but on average, for what I see people spend on their loved ones for like long-term care, it's about $10,000 a month. And that's not something people budget and really ever think about and plan for. And that's one of the things that pops up for 50% of people that we meet with. We know that 50% of people will have some sort of long-term care. And that's a big, big expense that also goes into it.
Honestly, the best advice that I can give people and why I'm so passionate about what I do, everything that you've done throughout the accumulation stage is radically different than what you're going to need to know to prepare for the distribution stage. 10 years before you're thinking about it, at least 5 years before it. Find out all the things that you didn't know you needed to know and build a plan around that, a really solid plan. And then you just get to and through retirement very successfully. I'm not saying that if you haven't done it and you're within 2-3 years of retirement that you can't do it. But if I've got a younger listener out there who really wants to plan, let's make it happen now. Let's figure that out. That's the biggest thing. People do not know that they have to consider taxes because before that, everything came out of their paycheck. They're not thinking that they're going to need long-term care. They're just not thinking of all the things that are going to change. How they don't have time for the market to come back if it goes down. And of course, the market never going to go down, right? We haven't even talked about that.
What you're saying right there is so important for the listener to hear, because don't make your plan only off of, okay, I feel like I'm ready. Plan and prepare. So when that feeling comes, you're ready. And it sounds like also too, because some people may be listening there right now and thinking, I don't have enough money for retirement. It's all based upon the expenses. The lower the expenses, the less money you need for retirement. And for a lot of people out there, if we could solve for what's called the gap, the difference between what things like Social Security and pensions are going to provide versus what we've saved for retirement, that's where we can really start to add some clarity.
And I would say the other side, not to monopolize this, but the other side of that is there are people out there who actually have saved enough. They don't know, they're afraid. So they're going to continue to work longer than they have to, perhaps, and they don't even want to do that. That's where a real plan helps.
Yeah, and I see that a lot too. And I want to circle back to a piece that you brought up, Phyllis, is when we are younger and accumulating money and the economy is in a hard time, the market's down 25, 35%, you don't really think about that. But for people that are retired and they have those types of losses, even if they have a solid plan in place, the number one mistake I see people make is for retirement is taking too much risk and then having a big loss. And then they have to adjust their lifestyle. And so I think that's another thing is making sure, one, are you okay with how your investments are set up? And really asking yourself, have you changed your strategies from when you were accumulating money or being ready to distribute that money to you the rest of your life as far as income goes?
Absolutely. Do you guys find that oftentimes people really have no idea how much risk they're taking?
All the time.
It might be 90% of people I meet with don't know what their risk in their portfolio is.
They have no idea. We're blessed to do what we do, and we have really good conversations lots of times. But the other side of the financial advisor is sometimes we don't have fun conversations with our clients, and we have to have those tough ones. And I met with a couple last year, and they were dead set on retiring, and they lost about 25% of their portfolio at the end of 2022. There's no way they could retire once they lost that 25%. And so I think it's really, positioning yourself, not from a mental standpoint, just be ready for retirement, but positioning your portfolio, changing your strategies. You can't use the same exact strategies that got you to retirement and think they're going to work just as well all throughout your retirement.
Absolutely not. And a lot of people are of that belief that they can.
So one place we could start with too, so if we kind of look at it, first and foremost is we really need to know our budget, not what we think it is, but what it actually is based on math. We also want to get a kind of a compelling picture for what we want our retirement to look like. And then what I'm hearing is once you've got a plan, you're ready and you've confirmed the numbers, does your portfolio actually look like someone who's retired?
I think that's a huge, huge piece because it's a scary feeling. You're your own employer, you're paying your own paycheck, and you want to make sure that you're stable. And a lot of people, the big thing that hurts them is not necessarily saying being tax efficient or having low fees. It's having a big market loss. So changing those strategies and making sure that portfolio resembles someone that's retired.
That's key. That really is.
And what do you all think about as far as for some people that are so used to the market going up between like after 2008, we saw a huge bull market and things have been really rocky over the past few years. But what do you tell someone that they're taking too much risk and maybe one spouse really wants to reduce risk inside their portfolio and then the other spouse just says, hey, everything's going to be okay. The stock market always goes up. I think that's a conversation that couples need to have together because sometimes I meet with people and they're aligned with their goals. And other times, often what I see is one spouse is really wanting to change things and the other spouse wants to leave things how it was for the past 40 years.
Yeah, that's a difficult conversation. But, one of the things that I say, it kind of shakes it up. But do you really want to rely on hopium of the market to determine your goals? And I tell them that I worry about people who are trying to retire today because recently, even though we all know that perhaps the market could go down, but every time that it has, it's come up so quickly that most people just have blinders on. They think it's going to recover quickly. So I have to bring them back and Debbie Downer or doom and gloom, but that's only fair. Change the retirement drastically if the market stays down.
And you saw so much money put into the economy from COVID, but how long did it take for the market to come back from 2008? Roughly about 6 years or so, right? If you're investing in the S&P. But if you look at other time frames, it's been 8 years, 10 years. I would say the best way to really make yourself feel comfortable for retirement is plan for a worst case and hope for the best, because oftentimes a worst case does pop up, and your retirement's not a 2 or 3 years long. You're talking 30 plus years for most people. A lot can happen over a 30-year time frame.
I totally agree with you on that. And that kind of ties into that idea of, does your portfolio look like someone who's retiring soon? Because if the market takes a half a decade, sometimes a decade plus to get back to where it's at, well, do you have a half a decade or a decade to get back to where you're at? And what I will always ask the spouse who's comfortable with more risk is, are you willing to make your spouse continue working if this falls by more than what it should be, and then you have to continue working or go back to work?
Yeah. And that happens. That nail on the head of the couple I mentioned earlier. Both spouses wanted to retire, and one spouse had to continue on working simply because they had that market loss there. Looking at what's inside the portfolio, does it really line up with your current goals and what you're trying to achieve in your life?
Thomas, this has been awesome today. We've got, I feel like, a lot of tangible things.
We could talk about this all day, probably.
We really could. I've got a few rapid fire questions I want to ask you, and I don't want you to think, I just want you to answer. Now, obviously, every client is different. So some of these may be investing based, some of these may be personal based. So for those of you who are viewers out there, please don't take this part as specific advice. I just want to hear what Thomas has to say. Indexed annuity or variable annuity?
Index annuity all day long.
Mutual fund or ETF?
ETF.
High beta stock or low beta stock? This is for retirees.
Retirees, low beta stock.
Do you have a favorite child?
No.
Good answer.
My wife might listen to this, right? So I will say, right now I have an easier child. Once a 2-year-old starts talking and walking, I learned that they can tell you no, and the 6-month-old, 7-month-old, he can't tell you no yet. So one can be easier.
Thomas, awesome. Till next time, Phillis, take care. See y'all soon.
All right, appreciate it. Y'all have a good one.
You've been listening to the RPU podcast with Jordan Schwartz and Phillis Polvinas.